So my theme today is the EU, the Eastern Partnership in Ukraine. Volodymyr asked me to divide things in two, either side of a short break. So firstly, I'll talk in general about the EU and its Eastern Partnership policy, its foreign policy in general, and then after the break, more about Ukraine in particular. Now, it's easy to talk on these occasions about institutions and all the boring stuff about EU machinery. I'll do a little bit of that, but I also wanted to talk about the kind of modus operandi, because the way that EU foreign policy works, or doesn't work, is very specific. Russia does things differently, Ukraine does things differently. And that's part of the problem, that the parties don't understand each other and the different rules of the game. The Ukrainians, the Russians often think the EU simply isn't serious when it talks about human rights, for example. Some of you may have heard of Robert Cooper. He's a very authoritative source because not only has he written books on the EU foreign policy, but he has long been the kind of key maker of foreign policy at the heart of Brussels. His argument is that the EU's foreign policy is postmodern. What does that mean? Well, modern begins in 1648, which I'm sure you all know was the Treaty of Westphalia, the end of the 30 Years' War. Why on earth is that relevant? Well, it established the principle of sovereignty and princely statehood. And the kind of characteristic modus operandi for European foreign policy in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century was all about sovereignty. It was all about a balance of power between sovereign states. And securing that balance through alliances and hard power. Whereas Cooper argues that particularly since after 1989, after the end of communism, the European Union is based on completely different principles, sharing sovereignty together. He has this excellent quote about it being a highly developed system for mutual interference in each other's domestic affairs. That strength comes not from hard power or defending the sovereignty of a state, but by putting all those sovereignties together. The EU's definition of security tends to emphasise or de-emphasise hard power and prefer soft power. There's a famous essay by the philosopher Immanuel Kant about perpetual peace. The EU ideal is that all countries will share the same vision of how to establish cooperative sovereignty. The American vision is very different, but I'm not supposed to talk about America. But one reason why we have so much tension with the US EU relationship is that although America buys into part of this vision, the emphasis on human rights, across borders and so on, America thinks that we completely neglect traditional hard power. That only the United Kingdom and France are serious about military spending, with the possible exception of Estonia. It's small, but it wants to push military spending up to 3% of GDP. The EU is naive, that it neglects the traditional importance of hard power. Even France and the UK are sort of, in the current economic crisis, are allowing their military capacity to decline. We in Britain have famously ordered a new aircraft carrier without aircraft because we can only afford half of it. The Libya war was very significant in this respect, a kind of postmodern war without actual engagement, everything done from the sky. So the EU is not good at hard power, both in its kind of traditional military sense and in the kind of being tough, arm-twisting kind of sense. We're not very good at sanctions. In fact, there is this kind of ideological belief that you often hear in the West, too soon, whenever the issue is discussed, that sanctions simply don't work. Because of our concern for human rights and soft power, we always think about the likely effect on populations rather than smart sanctions against elites. But that is beginning to change. You have the Magnitsky list targeting certain people in Russia, that is being broadened out to possible sanctions against even Ukrainian officials as we go forward. One reason for that is the involvement, the kind of privatisation of soft value foreign policy in the European Union. That a lot of the initiative for pushing for a tougher line on people with poor human rights records is done by private NGOs, private citizens, often on the internet, hence netizen, this horrible word, internet citizens. And one other problem with this approach is that the EU assumes that the rest of the world is like the EU. That Kant's idea of universal peace is only possible if everybody else buys into the same values. In the last few years, it's become increasingly obvious that that's not the case. China, Russia operate very differently. Nor is the EU good at bilateral relations with states on its borders who don't buy into the kind of EU vision of adopting EU standards. That's why we've always had problems with Turkey in particular, and will do with Ukraine if it moves in that direction. So the first thing to note about the EU is this kind of postmodern value-based policy. The second is what's called the Schuman model, after the French foreign minister who helped found the pre-EU institutions in the 40s, 50s, the European Island Steel Community, etc. And his assumption was always, if you get countries to cooperate together economically, then from that will follow political cooperation. That seemed to work with France and Germany. It helped that he was half French, half German himself. He was born in Luxembourg. But this is still the kind of default way of thinking within the EU, that from economic cooperation will follow political cooperation. My subject isn't the euro crisis, but that has been an assumption in the euro crisis, and that's why we've not been able to steer our way out of it. We've mentioned Kant, we've mentioned Schuman, who was half German. Third thing to notice about the EU foreign policy is that it's serious about rules. That membership in the club comes from adopting, applying and obeying the rules. The rule book being, as you know, the acquis communautaire. And the underlying assumption, by the way, that rules are a good thing and that all bureaucrats are nice, honest, and they have the public interest at heart. In the post-Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union, that isn't always the case. I won't talk much about Russia because that's, again, not my subject, but it is interesting to note that Russia's approach is more or less totally the opposite. It's much more 19th century. Russia still believes in things like the balance of power. It doesn't believe in joining. It doesn't believe in subsuming its sovereignty in other people's clubs. And it believes in protecting its own absolute sovereignty. And it certainly doesn't believe in a highly developed system of interfering in each other's affairs. And if the EU tends to interpret all security problems in soft power terms, the Russian tendency is very much the opposite. So there is some slight hypocrisy here with Russia. I was hoping I might be able to click on these to bring them up. Can we do that? On the one hand, Russia says that it rejects attempts by the outside world to tell it what to do. But if you do actually have these kind of copycat Russian institutions. This one some of you may have heard of, the Russian Civic Institute for Election Rights, whose job is to criticise Western countries. So on the one hand, Russia tries to argue that, like Russia itself, post-Soviet states should ignore this kind of post-modern interference. They shouldn't be told what to do by foreigners from Brussels. Boris Kolarov has called this the de-internationalization of society in post-Soviet space, and a rejection of kind of criticism from outside. That's too long a list, we'll leave that. But I'm sure you're all familiar with the Russian phrase sovereign democracy, which basically means democracy à la Russe, the protection of Russian internal space. But it's also connected with this concept that Putin likes, konkurentsposobnost, ability to compete. Now this is seriously 19th century. Sovereignty is for the strong. So, in part, this is a positive message. Russia will be more sovereign if it builds up its own power, its own military resources, its own economy. But the kind of flip side is that weak states do not deserve full sovereignty because they can't police it. So Russia and Ukraine have, Russia and the EU have very different modus operandi. Part of the problem with the way the EU operates in states like Ukraine is that there's much more of a clash between the two forces compared to the kind of 90s when expansion policy was directed at Central Europe, the Baltics. Russia simply wasn't a competitive factor, either in that region or at that time. Now it is. The neighbourhood policy was developed in the mid-noughties at a time when many things were changing. Most importantly, you had, well, from the EU's own point of view, you had enlargement, the big enlargement, the new members, Bulgaria and Romania coming later in 2004. So something had to come for those who were not to be offered enlargement. But it was also because of internal changes within the EU, the kind of constitutional treaty that was finalised in October. At the time, it looked like the Orange Revolution came just in time, that the Ukrainians were late, that there might be a possibility to kind of crash the party. Technically, the policy had been launched, but there was some hope that it could be redesigned. To fast forward slightly, I would blame most of the problems in the current relationship on Ukraine. But if we are to blame the EU, then it is most blameworthy at this particular time. Well, it didn't respond to the big changes that had happened or had potentially happened in Ukraine strongly enough or quickly enough. Because as it turned out, the window of opportunity was actually quite small. That the constitutional treaty that was finalised in October was defeated by two referenda, as I'm sure you know, in May and June 2005 in Holland and France. So the kind of positive period, the kind of catch-up period was actually quite small and too small to make a difference. So many people have quite rightly seen the neighbourhood policy as enlargement light, not offering the same, not offering an open route towards eventual membership. According to the key treaties, any European country can be a member as long as it fulfills the criteria. But the accession states of the 90s had much more of a clear pathway, a plan, a guide, whereas ENP has been characterised as a waiting room. People wait around without a clear definition of their way forward. Other criticisms are that it lumps the entire neighbourhood together, which basically means everyone from Morocco to Belarus, all of the countries of the Mediterranean South, as well as the post-Soviet East. The Eastern Partnership came about basically because the ENP was split in two. First of all, the French pushed the Union of the Mediterranean, which was launched in July 2008. That's actually now almost totally moribund because it's ridiculously old-fashioned. It came before the Arab Spring in 2011. Its assumptions are now totally outdated. But already in early 2008, there was this sense that if something was going to be done for the South, then it had to be done for the East too. And the war in Georgia in August, very much accelerated but did not initiate the planning of that process. As I'm sure many of you know, it's seen as an improvement, but it still lumps together an awkward group of 6 countries without necessarily much in common. So there's been increasing call to differentiate more. So you have this rather terrible slogan in English, more for more, which basically means more conditionality and more reward. If states enact more reform, they get bigger prizes. And the key prizes that are now on offer, again, I'm sure you know, association agreements, deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, and most important for Eastern public opinion, easier visa travel. At the same time, however, you've had a big shift of attention and resources to the Mediterranean neighbourhood since the Arab Revolt. In fact, insofar as there is attention to the East, it's often historical. You know, what can the Poles, for example, with their experience of transition, teach the Arabs beginning their transitions in the south, rather than recognising that there are still plenty of problems to be addressed in the East. What are those problems? Well, the first is that there is much more competition with Russia in the Eastern Partnership region than there was with Russia in the Central European states, Baltic states in the 1990s. Though this is not a competition, a geopolitical competition as Russia often phrases it, but between two very different modus operandi, between the EU's soft power and Russia's hard power, between the EU's slow power and Russia's relative agility. The other problem is that these are post-Soviet states, so they're all new states. They may have long histories going back, but not really in the 20th century. So in terms of their current statehood, they all have some of them are weak states, but more exactly, most are strong states with very weak societies. Their economies are weak. Azerbaijan has high growth. It has oil and gas. But it also has resource curse. Although it's doing well in sort of headline terms, that's very top-heavy. I call Georgia a problem or a challenge. By this I mean Georgia under Saakashvili. To show a bit of personal bias, I like the Georgians under Saakashvili. They did a lot of things right. They were aggressive and rude about how the EU operated in a good way. This kind of very complacent assumption that Brussels knows best, that one model fits all, that what you should do is accept the existing rules, was constantly questioned by the Georgians. Particularly the kind of Weberian assumption that bureaucracy is a good thing. The Georgians like to point out that exactly the same institution in Switzerland and in countries like Georgia would have completely different effects. That if you have a forestry commission, this was one of the actual arguments, if you have a forestry commission in Switzerland, it's probably run by good bureaucrats who will look after the trees and apply environmental rules, whereas the same institution in Georgia will be run by corrupt rent seekers who will use the office to extract bribes. Any country which has a kind of price list for positions in a bureaucracy obviously operates according to different principles. You become a bureaucrat in order to earn back your investment. So under Saakashvili, the Georgians were pro-European, but they engaged in actually a quite constructive critique of how the acquis communautaire didn't work and wouldn't work in the same way in kind of post-Soviet conditions. Where Georgia goes under Ivanishvili, we don't know yet. Energy is obviously a particular issue. I will leave that to your discussion tomorrow. But The energy issue works on two levels. There is, first of all, the technical, the objective stuff about where the pipelines are, dependency, who uses whose gas and oil. But this kind of problem of cultural misunderstanding is also present. Yanukovych's recent remarks, for example, about the third energy package are a classic example of cultural misunderstanding. That Yanukovych said, the third energy package is rubbish. The EU has never helped us in negotiations with Russia. Whereas from the EU perspective, this isn't what the third energy package says. Again, we go by particular rules, clearly stated. There are some important things in there about unbundling. The Lithuanians, for example, better understand how this works. They've used the third energy package very well to say to Gazprom, it's not us, and we've got nothing against you and your horribly expensive gas. It's just that the rules that the European Commission sets force us to try and leave you out of our market. Whereas Yanukovych talks in more hard power terms about simply who's a friend and who isn't. Biggest problem of all, though, in the region is political. This graph shows the 6 Eastern Partnership states, and it shows how Freedom House has rated their democracy, or lack of it, from 2001 to 2010. The important thing is that the general trend is not up. Ukraine received better scores briefly immediately after the Orange Revolution, then it stagnated, and it's since declined quite sharply. There aren't any other exceptions. Georgia, interesting, this is Georgia. Georgia is deterioration, slight improvement, but then deterioration in Saakashvili's later years. Georgia gets better marks for good governance and public sector reform. But on this basic democracy score, stagnation or worse. So where there is progress, it was only temporary. You could perhaps argue that Moldova is somewhat undermarked, that things have improved in some areas since the current coalition took office in 2009. But the point here is the general trend, not just that you have 6 countries where there are problems, but in most cases those problems have been getting worse. So it's not just Ukraine where problems have developed, but Belarus and Azerbaijan were always non-democracies. Armenia has its problems at the moment, etc. So, the search for a success story, which is what currently preoccupies the EU with its Eastern Partnership, is not looking good. You have 6 states. Belarus was never going to be a success story unless something fundamental changed. There was some investment in that idea in the run-up to the 2010 election, but it was brutally disappointed. Azerbaijan isn't going to change so long as it has oil and gas. Armenia, there were some hopes, but you basically just had an election without any serious opposition to Sargsyan, the president. Although the kind of token opposition who stood against him did surprisingly well, and protests are ongoing. So really it was a choice of three. Georgia got very high marks for its public sector reform from some people, such as me, but it didn't do what the EU wanted. It was always very critical of the EU's style and approach, which is one reason why Georgia under Ivanishvili has got so much EU criticism so quickly. In fact, it's even been accused of Ukrainianization, by which they mean selective justice against the other side, the former government, now the opposition. So rightly or wrongly, Georgia looks like a fading success story. Moldova was the big hope. Moldova is kind of, in many ways, the anti-Ukraine. Much better at knowing what the EU wants and ticking the right boxes, following the rules, adopting the rules, and was being scored very highly until the present political crisis erupted. Which leaves Ukraine, which we'll talk about in the second half. The main decision makers for Eastern Partnership policy is the Commission. It is they who hosted the summit a couple of weeks ago, and they will be in charge of the preparation. Russia, and often Ukraine, doesn't always understand this. It assumes that member states still matter. They do, but not all member states have equal foreign policy weight. It's better to understand how member states influence the Commission by thinking of foreign ministers as political entrepreneurs. There are some who are interested in the East and who play an active role, but their number is about 3 or 4. So you have Carl Bildt, Foreign Minister of Sweden, Sikorski, Foreign Minister of Poland. They're individually very important. In some ways, this is good news for Ukraine because member state-wise, it does not have an obvious coalition of friends. It used to rely on, used to hope it could rely on mainly on the new member states, particularly Poland as a kind of historical friend, and on the northern member states who are more pro-enlargement in general and less integration in general, Sweden in particular, the UK in particular. However, these also tend to be the Protestant states which are most keen on soft power and human rights politics. Poland's relationship with Ukraine has deteriorated. It's best summed up by a German word, Hassliebe, simultaneous love and hate. Hate is probably the wrong word. Frustration is probably a better word. And the Poles learnt fairly early on, after joining the EU in 2004, that the way to have political influence was not to be seen as a kind of advocate of special causes all the time. insofar as people in Brussels always expected the Poles to push a particular line against Eastern Europe, it was kind of discounted. Whereas by playing more with the biggest member states and about EU foreign policy in general, Poland has been able to kind of increase its influence. So it won't diminish that influence by being just an advocate of special causes like Ukraine. Ukraine has thought of the Baltic states. Yanukovych just went to Vilnius. Some people have used the phrase the last window in Europe. If Poland is a problematical friend, Lithuania is less interested in other things and therefore can be more interested in Ukraine's advocacy in particular. This is partially true, but ultimately, sadly, Lithuania isn't that important within the EU, given its size. Germany is often thought of as a puppet manipulated by Russia. This is not true. There is a traditional pro-Russian line, but that was much more true during the Schröder period. Once Merkel came to power, there has been an attempt to kind of balance the Russia policy with the EU policy, with the Eastern Partnership policy to a much greater extent. But Germany is one of those northern countries, although it's half Protestant, half Catholic, which is in the Protestant human rights camp. So some people think that Germany may become more Ukraine friendly if the German elections this year turn out a particular way. That is very unlikely. Germany's commitment to human rights is pretty stable. Its attempt to balance this kind of Russia and Eastern Europe policy also fairly long term. So Ukraine doesn't have any obvious powerful advocates. In fact, Ukraine's problem is more the opposite, that within an EU of 27, soon to be 28, there are some obvious veto powers. So even if we get the association agreement finally signed, its ratification through every European member state may be the problem. So, to conclude, before talk more about Ukraine in particular, so we've already talked about these very different modus operandi. The EU has one, Russia has a different one. Does Ukraine have one of its own, or does it share elements of the other two? That is the basic problem, because it's not at all clear. In general, there's a lack of real substantive foreign policy thinking in Ukraine. I just drove past the former Vyshchepartyna Skola on Melnikova, which is now, what, the Foreign Policy Institute?
Some people are here from the...
Oh, I was going to be rude about it, so I won't then. I don't see much foreign policy thinking coming out of Ukraine. Some it's very hard even to identify a kind of underlying real modus operandi, because even the people in charge haven't defined it particularly well. One modus operandi is to do what the EU wants. Countries like Poland are very clear that they were able to absorb all of the acquis communautaire because of the overriding importance of the general project. They wanted to rejoin Europe. So they even swallowed bits that they didn't understand or didn't really want, because that was important to know. But that's basically the model. Brussels, unfortunately, doesn't really negotiate. One size fits all. There is a rule book. The acquis communautaire, you either adopt it and become a member or you don't. In recent years, it's been fashionable to compare Ukraine with Turkey. Turkey has wanted to be a member for a long time, but it's never seemed further away from membership. The way that Ukraine sees Turkey, maybe, is not the way that Turkey actually is. But I think what Ukrainians normally have in mind is that Turkey is a big neighbour of Europe, economically powerful, able to negotiate on its own terms, not in this kind of normal unilateral way of absorbing the acquis communautaire or not. But Turkey is able to do so, if it is, for very particular reasons. It's a long-standing member of NATO. It's always been a very important military, hard power partner, particularly for the Americans. Its economy is powerful and has done extremely well in the last 10 or 15 years in a very different way to Ukraine's. Most of its success is in SME sector, makes up almost 60% of the Turkish economy, less than 20% in Ukraine. Turkey also has a kind of foreign policy partnership with the EU because it poses a kind of policeman in its own neighbourhood. Its own overlapping neighbourhood, as Davutoglu, foreign minister, likes to put it. Turkey is a responsible power in its various own overlapping spheres of influence. Not really the post-Byzantine world, that's far too long ago, but post-Ottoman, Balkans, Middle East, Turkic-speaking countries, or areas of Turkic business influence. Whereas it would be difficult to speak of a Ukrainian neighbourhood, certainly even more difficult to speak of overlapping Ukrainian neighbourhoods. One of the questions in the first session was about cooperation with neighbours. Ukraine doesn't even cooperate that well with Moldova. One of you had read something I wrote about post-Titoism. What does that mean? Tito, as leader of post-war Yugoslavia, founded and led the kind of non-aligned movement. At the time of the Cold War, of two camps, East and West, the non-aligned movement was non-aligned, not part formally of either camp. Not just Yugoslavia, but India and others were important parts of that movement. And what made them powerful and influential was their pivotal position. It was the fact that you had a Cold War, an East and a West, and that the addition of even a marginal country like Yugoslavia to one side or the other had such important potential consequences. It didn't actually mean equidistance. Yugoslavia was still a socialist country, albeit a unique one. But Tito was able to play that game of balance quite well. So the phrase post-Titoism came out of an interview I did with Modest Kolarov, a political technologist in Moscow, who used the phrase to refer to the Eastern Partnership, collective Titoism, that the six were guilty of all playing a game of balance rather than doing as Russia told them. Post, though, because we don't have the Cold War anymore, you don't have two powerful blocs engaged in a geopolitical game of influence. But as I tried to say earlier, this very different contest between modus operandi, between the EU's postmodern model and the Russia's hard power 19th century model. There are different ways of playing that game of balance. To be honest, Belarus plays it most well because of its particular attraction to Russia. Russia, there were problems in the relationship in 2009, 2010. We can talk about Belarus in the questions and answer period if you want. Basically, since November 2011, Russia has restored at the previous level of subsidy to Belarus, which is enormous. It's 30% of GDP. Cheap gas, cheap oil, various other forms of subsidy. Belarus is a small country which gets, in comparative terms, an enormous amount of support out of playing this particular game, mainly because one side is so concerned about its potential defection. It's not like Yugoslavia, where you have equal sides playing the same game. Certain other post-Soviet states are able to play a game of balance because they have resources. Azerbaijan is the most obvious. It has oil and gas that a lot of people want. Even better, it has a lot of potential partners. Not just Russia and the West, but in the Near East, in Turkey too. So it can play a game of multiple balance. In Ukraine, it's rarely called balance. We have this traditional phrase of a multi-vectored policy. The game, or the kind of tactic, was played very differently under Kushma and under Yanukovych. If you think about Kushma's first term, 94-99, in the middle of that term, 96-97, he was able to negotiate simultaneous, important agreements with NATO, Charter on Distinctive Partnership, with the EU, with the US, the Gore-Kushma Commission, with Russia, the kind of state treaty between Russia and Ukraine, the Black Sea Fleet deal. All of that happened at the same time. Whereas under Yanukovych, balancing has tended to be sequential. That Ukraine asks something from Russia, and it asks something from Brussels. And because it's sequential, it plays, its trading game is more obvious. That when it's in Brussels, it makes the threat to defect to Moscow. When it's in Moscow, it makes the threat to defect to Brussels. It's also too blatantly mercantilist. Ukraine is after something normally, a commercial concession. Normally. And that kind of game of blatant trading works particularly badly on the EU side, which normally doesn't think in those kind of obviously mercantilist kind of ways. There also seems to be this sense that the current Ukrainian elite thinks they can say different things to different audiences, and the different audiences won't connect the dots. The example I was giving to Volodymyr earlier was that Yanukovych recently said in Vilnius that Tymoshenko was in prison because she made a political show of her trial, right? Which shows, I mean, that's a really terrible thing to say in Brussels, because it kind of makes opponents' case about selective prosecution and abuse of the judiciary pretty clearly. But we were listening in Vilnius. You know, Lithuania is a EU member, after all. Most importantly, though, Ukraine has things the wrong way round. Ukraine is not Azerbaijan. It doesn't. There is a hypocrisy in foreign policy. I also said to Volodymyr, there's an old academic joke in the West, the only consistent standard in international relations is the double standard. It's true that international relations is still, to some extent, about power and resources. Most obvious recent case of that being the Parliamentary Assembly vote on Azerbaijani political prisoners through astute Azerbaijani lobbying and blatant double standard. The motion was defeated. There are no political prisoners in Azerbaijan. And those voting against weren't just the people that you'd expect, the Russians, the Turks themselves. Sadly, most of the British delegation voted against the motion because of BP and its economic interests and all that kind of thing. But the double standard basically applies to people who already have resources. You know, if you have nuclear weapons like North Korea, you are treated differently to Iraq, which didn't ultimately have weapons of mass destruction. As an interesting aside, this is what Mrs. Thatcher always used to say about our nuclear weapons. She ignored the moral case completely. She basically said, nuclear weapons are a good thing because it gives us more diplomatic weight. Right? We punch above our weight, to use the boxing metaphor. The double standard applies to Britain too, as long as we keep our nuclear weapons, is what Mrs. Thatcher used to say. But Ukraine doesn't yet have that kind of resource or blackmail potential, but sometimes behaves as if it does. So fourth possibility, that I wrote an op-ed about the dangers of a Sinn Féinist foreign policy. Sinn Féin, the original Irish National Party, the name in Gaelic means ourselves alone, me sami, very 19th century statement of nationalism. And originally independent Ireland was very much isolationist. You have a kind of double problem with the kind of political culture of the current elite. One is that you have the culture of a region, the Donbass, transferred to national government. The culture of the Donbass, I won't go into details, I'm sure you know better than me, is tough, it's single party, it's about strong leadership, it's about showing partiality. It is actually important to make a semi-public show of punishing your enemies and rewarding your friends in a semi-public way, right, to kind of produce an accumulation of power. But the Donbass isn't a country. You know, the Donbass can behave that way within Ukraine. It doesn't have too many foreign policy consequences. When you transfer that kind of modus operandi to a country, it does have foreign policy consequences. And the second factor is the rise of the family, both literal and metaphorical. Hence this rather nice phrase of Yulia Mostova about a nice play on words between samostiny and semya, independence in the family. One particular point worth emphasising is that hypothetically, if the family took over the whole of the country, then in theory they would also digest its raison d'etat. If they ran the whole country, they would also have to think in foreign policy terms. But most of the family's interests at the moment are domestic. Other oligarchs trade abroad. Akhmetov sells steel, exports electricity. Other people import, Firtash imports gas. So it's very sensitive to Russian policy coming from the opposite direction, the price of gas, etc. Whereas for the moment, the family's interests are concentrated within Ukraine. So insofar as the family is powerful, it doesn't have to think so much about foreign policy consequences. So it's far from clear which of these four possibilities is actually driving Ukrainian foreign policy at the moment. I think all four are, which is why you get this kind of awkward contradiction and delivery problem. That you have public statements, you have promises, consequences, delivery doesn't necessarily arrive. Good example is one of the rare occasions I could find of an attempt to define Ukrainian foreign policy. A speech by the last Foreign Minister Hryshchenko. Be on the MFA website, but here I'm quoting from Zrcalo Tiznia. Now his article, he talked about three possible models. The joining model, the EU model, he called the Polish model. Modernisation under the tutelage of the EU, i.e. adopting the acquis, swallowing everything that the EU wants you to do. In this particular article, he was surprisingly pessimistic about that, saying that a full Polish model for Ukraine simply wasn't possible because too many EU partners were opposed because of emotions rather than rational calculation. And this kind of implication that Ukraine didn't want to join the West anyway because it was in crisis. Then he talked about the Turkish model, which seemed to be his preferred model. That we will do the same thing because it's a good thing. We will adopt European standards independently, not because the EU Commission is constantly demanding that we do so, but because we recognise that that is in our own interest. But thirdly, he also said some very incoherent things about the Chinese model, which he didn't define, because what people normally understand by the Chinese model, the Beijing consensus, would be a huge leap in a different direction. China is not a democracy, it has a monopoly governing party. Not just its approach to politics, but actually to economics. Its approach to politics is more authoritarian in Ukraine. Its approach to the economy is actually arguably more libertarian in Ukraine. So kind of Yushchenko toyed with this idea, but he didn't really define it, apart from in proxy terms. He talked about political stability, predictable rules in the economy, and positive demographic dynamics as an example for Ukraine to follow, which is a hostage to fortune. Obviously, Ukraine is nowhere near positive demographic dynamics. When Yanukovych first came to power, there was an attempt to say that political stability was justified in instrumental terms, that Ukraine, like Singapore, with political stability would be more able to push through difficult but liberal reforms. We can discuss this, but I don't see much evidence of that, unfortunately. And even political stability itself is now arguably under threat. So where do we go from here? The way forward is difficult. Because Ukraine's modus operandi is a combination, not just of Russia's and the EU, but these 4 other aspects. We had a summit, a reasonably successful one, because it happened a couple of weeks ago. There was a surprising rabbit pulled out of a hat in the form of a loan offer. But the loan is tied to the conditionality, which seems, if Ukraine doesn't fulfill that conditionality, it's not going to get the money. So in some ways, it was an easy offer. The timescale is not at all promising. The Vilnius summit is in November, but the EU stated that it will make up its mind by May. The biggest problem is what it has to make its mind up about. There's this broader strategic problem that Ukraine's direction or modus operandi is not clear. There is the tactical problem that the EU's own defined conditionality is not clear either. Things were worse a year ago. Things were far too mnogoголосny in Russian. Would that be in Ukrainian? Багатоголосny. Even over selective prosecution, different EU leaders were saying completely different things. There was some progress at the December meeting of the European Council. 3 areas of conditionality were defined. One is progress on the issue of selective prosecution. Second, rather strangely, proper conduct of elections. I say strangely because the election had happened. The next one isn't until 2015. And thirdly, and most vaguely, progress on necessary supporting measures to push forward the association agreement. Basically, that's EU speak. The first is the one that matters, but is the hardest to define. Some EU people want retrospective change. They don't like what's been done to Tymoshenko and others, and they'd like that to be reversed. But how far is unclear. So for some EU leaders, action has to be retrospective. For others, it has to be prospective, that Ukraine should comply either with what the Cox-Kwasniewski Commission comes up with, or any judgments of the European Court on Human Rights. There are 4 cases. There are 2 on Lutsenko, there are 2 on Tymoshenko. There's been 1 judgment on Lutsenko, but that means 3 are forthcoming. Ukraine, as a member, as a signatory to the Convention on Human Rights, should fulfil those judgments anyway, but not every state clearly always does. Thirdly, there is Fuller's mysterious list, which is either 11 or 19 criteria. Ukrainska Pravda published a list of 11. Most of those are underlying reforms to the judicial process, to the procuracy, to the criminal code, to reverse some of the changes that were made in the summer of 2010 to the way that the Higher Council of Justice operates and so on and so forth. Which is neither retrospective nor prospective. It is an attempt to try and make sure that something like the Tymoshenko case never happens again if the judiciary is improved and reformed. Which means that the EU's criteria are still all over the place. So if, in theory, that's good news. It means that it ought to be possible for the authorities to demonstrate goodwill by making a key change in any of these 3 areas, as long as it's substantive, that might convince enough people. Releasing Lutsenko, for example, might break the logjam. I can't say for certain because the criteria for what the EU wants are for once simply not clear. But one advantage, and Volodymyr wanted me to finish on a positive note, one positive aspect is the negative trend in Georgia and even Moldova. The EU wants a success story. It was betting on other countries, so the tide may be moving back towards betting on Ukraine. If Kyiv recognises that and proves willing, something could still be done before November.